Hey guys, tonight we are slipping into the dim, gaslit haze of Victorian London, where people spent long nights pacing creaky floorboards and counting every tick of the clock. You can almost feel the heavy curtains brushing your shoulder as you push past them, the fire dying in the grate, the streets outside restless even at midnight. Imagine yourself lying on a too-soft feather mattress that sinks like a marsh, with carriages clattering endlessly past your window. You're supposed to be asleep, but you aren't, because it's 1873, and insomnia has just become the Empire's most fashionable affliction. You probably won't survive this without a little sarcastic sigh. Yes, even in the age of steam engines and empire, people were still Googling, well, Victorian Googling, why can't I sleep? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know your location and local time in the comments, because somewhere, someone is watching this at 3 a.m., already embodying the spirit of tonight's topic. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward, and the first thing to notice is that sleeplessness wasn't just a private misery in this period. It was practically a badge of sophistication. In a society obsessed with productivity and propriety, losing sleep meant you were working hard, thinking deeply, or worrying properly. Aristocrats sometimes boasted about restless nights, as if insomnia proved their sensitive nerves. Middle-class professionals claimed they were too burdened with responsibility to drift off, and physicians, eager to carve out a new medical territory, declared sleeplessness a distinct disease worth diagnosing, debating, and, conveniently, charging for. But insomnia wasn't just about lying awake. It was about lying awake in a world transformed by industrial rhythms. Gaslight stretched the day beyond nature's boundaries. Factories clanged through twilight. Trains shrieked into stations after midnight. Suddenly, the night wasn't truly night anymore, and your body didn't know when to stop. Imagine being told, sleep is natural, while your neighbor's piano lessons thumped through thin walls until 2 a.m. Victorians may have invented some wonderful things, but they also invented sleepless suburbia. The mainstream fact here is that medical journals of the 1860s and 1870s began formally categorizing insomnia as a modern nervous complaint, linking it to overwork, new technologies, and the rush of city life. The quirky tidbit: some people tried to measure their insomnia with logbooks, carefully writing down the exact minutes spent tossing and turning, because nothing says I'm relaxed like a spreadsheet of failure to sleep. Historians still argue whether this obsession with cataloguing sleeplessness helped patients or just deepened the anxiety. You wander into a Victorian bedroom and notice the irony. Every tool designed for comfort somehow makes sleep harder. Heavy brocade curtains block fresh air. Feather mattresses trap heat and sag in the middle. Even the prized ticking clock on the mantelpiece is loud enough to count your heartbeat. And let's not forget the chamber pot by the bed, because nothing breaks up a restless night like the clatter of porcelain. The Victorians also had a peculiar way of romanticizing insomnia. Poets described it as a tragic muse whispering in the dark. Novelists used it to show moral turmoil, and spiritualists treated sleepless nights as portals to other realms. So while you might be groaning and staring at the ceiling, they would claim you were in communion with higher powers, or at least with the neighbor's cat howling on the fence. Picture yourself pacing, candle in hand, the flame throwing odd shadows. You tell yourself, it's only a phase. But then someone cheerfully hands you a pamphlet explaining that insomnia can cause heart disease, hysteria, and premature death. Very reassuring. The Victorian cure for insomnia often started by reminding you how dangerous it was not to cure it. That's like a sleep app today, buzzing at 1 a.m. to announce you failed to meet your rest goals. Still, there's comfort in knowing you're not alone. Imagine the great and good of the empire, the bankers, clerks, school teachers and seamstresses, all awake together in a collective symphony of sighs. Queen Victoria herself was rumoured to have restless nights, burdened by grief and paperwork. And Charles Dickens, poor fellow, often wandered London streets until dawn, muttering lines of prose while others dreamed. If he had owned a Fitbit, it would have exploded. So here you are, lying back on a too-firm pillow, listening to the faint hum of gas outside and the creak of wood beams. The night stretches ahead, and you realize that for Victorians, insomnia was more than a nuisance. It was a symbol of modern life, unwanted but inevitable, woven into the ticking rhythm of an empire that never really slept. And with every restless breath, you become one of them. You wander out of the sagging feather bed and step into the cool hush of a Victorian street. It is past midnight, yet you are far from alone. Across the city, you can hear the hiss of gas lamps and see the flicker of candles in windows where other sleepless figures stir. For centuries, people's nights had been defined by darkness, silence, and the slow rhythm of the moon. But in the Victorian age, light itself became a culprit. Candlelight and gaslight, far from being your friends, stretched your evenings and made your restless brain linger long after your body begged for rest. The mainstream fact here is that widespread use of gaslighting in the 19th century dramatically extended waking hours in cities like London, Manchester, and Edinburgh. It wasn't just industry that worked overtime. Domestic spaces glowed longer too. Shops stayed open later. Streets gleamed like stage sets, and families lingered in parlors well into the night. For the first time, large swaths of people experienced what we now call light pollution. Instead of the natural ebb and flow of darkness, your body clock, your circadian rhythm was nudged, poked, and confused. You were biologically ready for rest, but the world around you insisted on wakefulness. The quirky tidbit: some Victorian moralists actually warned that gas lamps made people sinful, not just sleepless. Too much nighttime visibility, they said, encouraged gossip, wandering, even flirtations in the streets. If the devil worked overtime, one clergyman joked, he surely invented the gas lamp. Historians still argue whether sleeplessness rose dramatically because of artificial light, or whether Victorians simply became more obsessed with naming and diagnosing it. Now imagine yourself as a weary clerk, trudging home after 10 hours of bookkeeping. You turn the corner, and instead of the comforting darkness you once knew, you're assaulted by a row of blazing lamps buzzing like miniature suns. They hum, faintly, and sputter, casting a ghostly orange halo on the cobblestones. Your eyes, tired from tiny ledgers and cramped handwriting, are suddenly wide awake again. The night is no longer soothing. It is electric, jangly, insistent. Even in private homes, the invasion continues. Families that once nodded off around. The hearth at 9 now read penny cereals or practiced piano exercises until midnight. Children whisper under blankets. Grandmothers knit until their hands ache. And you, poor you, lie in bed, eyelids twitching, while the gaslight from the street filters through the curtains, outlining every wrinkle in the wallpaper. If you have ever tried to fall asleep in a hotel room with a neon sign outside, you know exactly the frustration they felt. Of course, Victorians tried to adapt. Some households insisted on heavy velvet curtains, not for luxury, but to block out the street's artificial glow. Others turned off lamps early, claiming it preserved health. And then there were the inventors, forever peddling little shields for lamps, tinted glass, or soothing shades, meant to soften the glare. You picture yourself fussing with one of these gadgets, only to realize the contraption itself was more irritating than the light. You might think, why not just blow out the candle? But here's the rub. Many people believed that sudden darkness made it harder to sleep. They preferred to leave a faint glow in the corner, like a nightlight. That tiny flame, however, flickered and sputtered, filling the room with shadows that danced across the ceiling like mischievous sprites. Instead of calming you, they kept your imagination busy. One poor soul confessed that he spent hours watching the shadows morph into faces, animals, and grotesque monsters. Nothing says bedtime like a personal horror show. The odd thing is, sleeplessness didn't strike everyone equally. The rich could retreat to country estates where nights were still dark. The poor, packed into city housing, found themselves surrounded by lamp-lit courtyards and echoing alleys. And then there were the factory towns, where enormous furnaces glowed through the night, painting the sky orange. Imagine lying in a cramped cot while the heavens themselves blaze like an eternal sunset. If you drifted off at all, your dreams would be filled with fire. Historians still debate whether the Victorian night was truly noisier than before, or whether people simply blamed their sleeplessness on modern inventions. But whether or not the soundscape changed, the glow certainly did. For the first time in history, you could walk down a London street at 2 a.m. and still read a newspaper under the lamps. Handy, yes, but not exactly conducive to snoozing. And so you, shuffling through this luminous world, find yourself in the curious paradox of progress. Light, meant to banish danger and extend leisure, instead becomes another thief of rest. Candlelight worries indeed. You blow one out, but a dozen more flicker to life outside. And the longer you watch them, the further away sleep seems to drift, until night itself feels like another exhausting workday. You find yourself lured into a narrow Victorian apothecary, its wooden shelves lined with bottles, powders, and little glass vials that glint under the faint gaslight. The air smells like a mixture of peppermint, bitter herbs, and something far more chemical. You're not here for cough syrup or a toothache remedy. You've arrived seeking the mysterious class of concoctions, all promising one simple miracle: sleep. And so begins your slow encounter with the strange tonics of the 19th century, where each sip is equal parts relief and roulette. The mainstream fact is straightforward enough. Many Victorian insomnia cures contain substances we now recognize as heavy hitters. Opium derivatives, alcohol, chloral hydrate, even tinctures of cannabis. These were not whispered secrets, but proudly sold, often without prescription, to anyone who had a few coins and a desperate need to shut their eyes. You might feel skeptical about gulping opium-laced syrup at bedtime, but back then, it was sold under comforting names like soothing cordial or children's quiet syrup. Nothing like dosing the entire family with narcotics to ensure a peaceful night. The quirky tidbit: some popular recipes added ground lettuce seeds, under the notion that lettuce carried natural soporific qualities. Yes, lettuce, the same limp leaves on your sandwich. Imagine sipping a bitter potion and consoling yourself that it's basically a liquid salad. And yet, doctors of the time swore it had merit. Historians still argue whether these plant-based additions were genuinely effective, or simply a way to mask the stronger, addictive ingredients lurking underneath. Picture yourself at the counter, where the apothecary carefully pours a dark amber syrup into a corked bottle. The label might read something melodramatic, like Dr. Blythe's Eternal Rest Elixir. You're instructed to take a spoonful at bedtime. Dutifully, you swallow it, and instantly, the warmth of alcohol coats your throat while the heavier undertones of morphine crawl into your system. You feel heavy, yes, but also oddly anxious, because your pulse races before it slows. And if you're unlucky, your dreams are filled not with peace, but with vivid, feverish landscapes. One Victorian diarist complained that such a tonic gave him visions of purple owls and upside-down churches. Effective? Maybe. Restful? Not so much. But the marketing was irresistible. Advertisements promised undisturbed repose and a quiet mind free from nocturnal agitation. Illustrated pamphlets showed blissful sleepers tucked under blankets, while captions reassured mothers that even infants could be soothed. You can almost hear the chuckle of the apothecary as he hands you 2 bottles instead of 1. For the road, he says, though it's only a 10-minute walk home. Of course, dangers lurked. Repeated use often led to dependence, a word Victorians used far more delicately: nervous reliance. Families quietly noticed that father could not sleep without his draught, or that mother's afternoon tea was always laced with a teaspoon of restful cordial. One journalist mockingly observed that half of London seemed to be drifting about in a semi-opiated haze, smiling politely while secretly addicted to sleep syrups. You can't help but smile at the irony. The cure for sleeplessness often created a cycle of greater sleeplessness when the body began to crave. Yet historians still argue whether most Victorians understood the addictive properties of these tonics. Some evidence suggests physicians were fully aware, but chose not to warn patients, perhaps fearing that truth would ruin their business. Others insist that medical science of the era was genuinely naive about long-term effects. Either way, you're left imagining yourself waking in the night, sweating, craving another spoonful of syrup, not because you're awake, but because the cure itself has rewired your rest. And it wasn't just the ingredients, it was the rituals. Families often gathered for a bedtime draft the way modern folks might gather for evening tea. Imagine children in flannel nightshirts lining up for their spoonful, the syrup sticky and unpleasant, but accepted as routine. Grandmother sighs as her nerves finally quiet. Father groans less about business debts. Everyone shuffles off to bed, lulled not by lullabies but by narcotics. You sit in the corner, spoon poised, half wondering whether to swallow. Let's not forget the unregulated recipes. Traveling salesmen peddled secret mixtures with flamboyant names. The restorative of Morpheus, lunar calm, or night-blooming remedy. They boasted exotic ingredients from far-off lands, Peruvian bark, Turkish opium, Indian hemp. The reality? Many were just high-proof alcohol with a dash of flavoring. So yes, technically they worked, because after enough brandy, you'll fall asleep whether you want to or not. And here you are, swaying gently after your sip, staring at the flickering lamplight with half-lidded eyes. The tonic has slowed your pulse, thickened your thoughts, but true rest feels elusive. Your body is heavy, but your mind tumbles in odd directions. You realize what countless Victorians must have realized. The potion promised sleep, but often delivered only stupor. And as you drift between wakefulness and chemical haze, you know that this chapter of insomnia history is less about comfort and more about survival, of the apothecary's business model, if nothing else. You shuffle farther along the street, drawn now not to the small corner apothecary, but to the booming world of Victorian patent medicines. The shop windows blaze with colour lithographs, promising miracle cures for every complaint of the modern body. Weak nerves, bad digestion, melancholy, and, of course, your relentless inability to sleep. Compared to the bitter syrups behind the apothecary's counter, these patent medicines are brash, confident, and proudly unaffiliated with any physician. You feel like you've stumbled into the 19th century equivalent of late-night TV infomercials, complete with glowing endorsements and questionable ingredients. The mainstream fact here is that the 19th century saw a patent medicine explosion, particularly in Britain and the United States. These concoctions weren't truly patented in the legal sense, but were marketed under proprietary brand names with secret recipes. Sleep cures were among the most aggressively advertised, often laced with chloral hydrate, opiates, or high levels of alcohol. They were sold everywhere: pharmacies, general stores, even traveling fairs. Imagine yourself browsing labels that boast "tested by royalty" or "approved by leading men of science," with absolutely no proof attached. The quirky tidbit: some bottles actually glowed faintly in the dark, thanks to the inclusion of phosphorus or radium in the mix. Yes, people were literally drinking things that shone on the shelf. One enthusiastic reviewer in 1890 praised a sleep tonic for its radiant clarity, as though glow-in-the-dark insomnia medicine was a mark of refinement rather than a nuclear red flag. Historians still argue whether customers truly believed these radiant brews helped, or whether the placebo of science in a bottle was the real sedative. Step closer, and you notice the artistry. Labels depict tranquil moonlit landscapes, doves perched on pillows, or cherubs yawning sweetly. The typography oozes trustworthiness. Nightshore syrup, Dr. Hamilton's safe slumber draft. Some bottles are wrapped in testimonials, letters allegedly penned by grateful customers. I, a barrister of Manchester, have not known a restless night since discovering this tonic. You roll your eyes, but the marketing works, tugging at your sleepless desperation. Of course, not all tonics were equal. Some contained little more than molasses and herbs, delivering sugar highs rather than slumber. Others were dangerous cocktails that knocked you unconscious, but left you with morning headaches and trembling hands. Picture yourself sipping one such potion. The first effect is warmth, then heaviness, and then nothing. You wake 10 hours later with cotton in your mouth, vague dizziness, and the distinct feeling that you've lost both a night and a chunk of dignity. Victorians adored these patent medicines, partly because they promised independence from doctors. Going to a physician was costly, time-consuming, and often humiliating. Buying a bottle from a shop required no questions, no probing examinations. It was, in a way, the birth of over-the-counter culture. You too might have relished the privacy. Just you and your glowing bottle. No lectures from anyone in a white coat. Still, scandals erupted. By the late 19th century, newspapers ran exposés about fraudulent patent medicines. Some bottles contained so much alcohol that customers were essentially buying fine spirits disguised as remedies. Others relied heavily on laudanum, an opium tincture, leading to widespread quiet addiction. Doctors began to sneer at these products, yet many continued prescribing them under different names. The irony was thick. A physician might condemn Dr. Sleepwell's night drops in public, then hand out nearly identical mixtures in his own office. Historians still argue whether the true harm lay in the medicines themselves or in the culture of secrecy surrounding them. Some patients no doubt achieved genuine relief. After all, chloral hydrate can knock you out cold. But long-term reliance, paired with the lack of transparency, left many households quietly enslaved to their glowing bottles. One social reformer remarked that half of England spends its nights intoxicated, yet calls it medicine. You wander through a Victorian home and see the bottles lined on a mantelpiece, proudly displayed like trophies. Visitors might comment on the fine china, the polished wood, and the elegant sleep tonics glowing softly beside the candlesticks. A guest even pours a tiny glass to steady the nerves after supper, as casually as we might sip chamomile tea today. It's unsettling, yet oddly charming. An empire tucked in by its own pharmaceuticals. And so, clutching your own bottle, you return to your room. The liquid inside looks suspiciously like cough syrup, but smells faintly of apples and alcohol. You tilt it back, feeling the burn, and wait for peace to descend. Instead, your mind spirals through strange half-dreams, your body heavy but your imagination restless. You realize, as countless Victorians must have, that the patent medicine trade sold less of a cure and more of a story, one in which science, progress, and trust in the bottle itself were supposed to ease the burden of sleepless nights. You leave the glowing bottles behind and wander into a parlor filled with curiosities. Not potions this time, but peculiar objects promising to lull your restless mind. Victorians adored gadgets. If there was a problem, someone somewhere had fashioned a mechanical contraption to fix it, often with more optimism than practicality. And insomnia, being the empire's favorite nervous complaint, inspired an entire catalogue of oddities. Tonight, you get to test them one by one. The mainstream fact here is that the late 19th century saw an explosion of medical appliances advertised as safe, scientific solutions for nervous ailments, including sleeplessness. These included vibrating chairs, pressure belts, head cooling contraptions, and weighted devices meant to calm the nerves. The idea was rooted in the fashionable field of nervous medicine, which claimed you could soothe or stimulate the nervous system with the right external gadget. It sounds suspiciously like modern sleep gadgets that promise miracles with gentle pulses or smart mattresses. Different century, same sales pitch. The quirky tidbit: one popular device was a hat filled with cold water, strapped to the head at bedtime to draw heat away from the brain. Yes, you went to bed wearing what was essentially a leaky bucket hat. Adverts assured users it would quieten turbulent thoughts. Imagine lying in your creaky Victorian bed, clutching your chamber pot, while also wearing a water balloon on your skull. Historians still argue whether such cooling methods offered any relief, or whether users simply fell asleep from sheer exhaustion after wrestling with the straps. But let's not stop with hats. Step into this gadget showroom, and you'll find the vibrating chair, an invention that promised to shake insomnia right out of you. You sit, you flip a switch, or rather, an attendant cranks a handle, and the chair hums like a distant sewing machine. The vibration supposedly harmonized the nerves, but in practice it just jiggled your teeth until you felt seasick. One gentleman claimed it lulled him into a nap, though his wife admitted it was only because he fainted. Another marvel, weighted blankets, though not the kind you know today. These were sometimes stiff sheets, layered with sand or metal pellets, advertised as restorative pressure coverings. They pressed so heavily that some users compared the sensation to being trapped under a cow. Still, there was method in the madness. The pressure did calm certain anxious sleepers, suggesting that even odd gadgets sometimes stumbled into genuine effectiveness. And then there were the timers. Picture a brass device by your bedside, ticking softly as it slowly released scents like lavender or camphor over the course of the night. It promised gentle inhalations until dawn, though in reality, the fumes could be overwhelming. Imagine trying to rest while your room steadily fills with the smell of a musty apothecary. You wouldn't be dreaming of sheep, you'd be dreaming of mothballs. Historians still debate whether Victorians truly believed in these devices, or whether they treated them more like novelty amusements. Evidence suggests that wealthy households often purchased gadgets more for show than for daily use. After all, what could impress dinner guests more than demonstrating the Sleep Inducer 3000, or whatever lofty name it carried, cranking it up in the parlor, and inviting everyone to marvel at modern science's triumph over yawns? You picture yourself fumbling with one of these head-cooling hats, trying to tie it snugly under your chin. The water inside sloshes, your pillow dampens. You whisper to yourself, "This is progress." Meanwhile, the neighbor 2 doors down is wrapped under his sandsheet blanket, wheezing like a trapped accordion. And across town, a banker is sitting in his vibrating chair, insisting that the buzzing means his nerves are finally soothed. All of you united in the common quest for sleep, but separated by equally ridiculous devices. And yet, there's a sweetness to it all. The earnestness of believing that science could tame something as ancient and stubborn as insomnia. The Victorians may not have had melatonin gummies or white noise machines, but they had their own arsenal, impractical, awkward, but deeply human attempts to control the uncontrollable. You lean back, the straps of the cooling hat digging into your scalp, and chuckle softly. If nothing else, the absurdity of it might lull you into slumber. After all, laughter sometimes works better than any gadget, and Victorians, for all their contraptions, often discovered that humor was the gentlest medicine of all. You slip the dripping contraption off your head and leave the gadget parlor behind. The air changes as you wander into another Victorian obsession: diet. If sleep wouldn't come, then perhaps the problem wasn't in the nerves or the mattress. It was in the stomach. To the 19th century mind, digestion and dreams were intimately linked. A restless gut, they believed, produced a restless mind. The mainstream fact here is that Victorian physicians frequently prescribed bedtime diets as insomnia cures. Bland foods were thought to settle the stomach, while heavy, warm snacks might lull the body into calm. Manuals advised against spicy dishes or alcohol too near bedtime, though many ignored the warning and swore by a nightcap. More curious still, medical journals sometimes recommended specific recipes designed not for flavor, but for inducing drowsiness. Take beef tea, for instance. It sounds hearty, but it was essentially a weak broth made by simmering beef shavings, until they surrendered only the faintest whisper of flavor. Doctors assured patients that a cup of this lukewarm liquid before bed would quiet their nerves. Imagine preparing a pot, sipping it slowly, and then lying awake, not from insomnia anymore, but from pondering why you just drank beef water. Other prescriptions were sweeter, literally. Plain biscuits or rusks, dry, twice-baked bread, were considered excellent midnight nibbles. The theory was that a touch of starch stabilized blood sugar and calmed jittery nerves. Whether this worked is uncertain, but households across Britain dutifully crunched their way into the small hours. One 1892 guide even suggested a spoonful of warm milk mixed with flour as a sure path to slumber. Modern nutritionists would call it unappetizing paste, but Victorians called it medicine. And then there were the quirkier remedies. Some sleep manuals advised chewing lettuce before bed, not as a salad, but straight leaves gnawed raw. Lettuce, they argued, contained sleep-bearing vapors. In truth, lettuce does have mild sedative compounds, but you'd need an entire wheelbarrow of the stuff to feel anything stronger than jaw fatigue. Still, earnest Victorians gnawed away in candlelit bedrooms, waiting for the magical sleep vapors to arrive. On the opposite end of the spectrum was alcohol. Despite doctors' mixed warnings, Many Victorians clung to their toddies, brandies, or glasses of port at bedtime. They defended the practice vigorously. A small dram soothed the system and made eyelids heavy. Of course, the next morning often brought headaches, but that was a problem for daylight hours. One witty newspaper column quipped, "The insomniac who takes brandy may at least console himself with pleasant dreams, though he shall pay interest upon them by dawn." Perhaps the most endearing tidbit, there existed sleep biscuits marketed specifically for nighttime use. Packaged as a health aid, they contained simple flours, sugars, and occasionally cocoa. The instructions were clear: eat one or two before retiring, then expect tranquility. Whether or not the biscuits worked, the marketing certainly did. Whole households purchased them, giving Victorian insomnia not just a gadget industry, but also a snack industry. As you wander through this dietary hall of remedies, you picture the nightly rituals. A mother stirring beef tea for her anxious son, a banker spooning flour milk paste with grim determination, an elderly couple nibbling rusks side by side in bed, and some unfortunate lettuce chewer crunching in the dark like a midnight rabbit. It's funny, yes, but also oddly touching. In their stubborn way, Victorians were practicing what we'd now call sleep hygiene. Small rituals meant to signal the body that it was time for rest. You imagine yourself following the regimen. A biscuit first, dry and sandy on the tongue. A cup of thin beef tea steaming faintly, with the aroma of boiled nothing. And finally, a lettuce leaf or two, chewed solemnly under the flicker of a candle. Do you feel drowsy, or just confused about your life choices? Perhaps both. Yet somewhere between the monotony of the foods and the sincerity of the effort, you notice your eyelids sinking. The Victorians may have lacked our melatonin capsules and sleep apps, but they understood something universal: the comfort of a ritual. The body, after all, doesn't just sleep. It responds to rhythm, to repetition, to the quiet suggestion that now, at last, it is time to rest, even if that suggestion comes in the form of a bowl of beef tea. You push the empty beef teacup aside and step softly into another Victorian parlour. This one cloaked not in steam or starch, but in candle smoke and whispers. Here, insomnia isn't treated with biscuits or gadgets, but with the invisible forces of the universe, or at least with what some Victorians insisted were invisible forces. When sleep refused to arrive, many people sought help not from doctors or kitchens, but from spiritualists, mesmerists, and magnetic healers who promised that the restless mind could be soothed by powers beyond the material world. The mainstream fact here is that Victorian Britain was steeped in a spiritualist craze. Seances became fashionable social events, where the sleepless might join late-night gatherings to contact the dead. Mediums promised not only glimpses of departed loved ones, but also an easing of troubled nerves. After all, how could you worry about your work deadlines when a table was floating across the room? You find yourself seated at such a séance. The room is dim, curtains drawn against the gaslight outside. A circle of pale hands rests on a polished mahogany table. The medium, dressed in black silk, breathes heavily and calls for spirits to bring peace. Suddenly, the table trembles. A knock sounds, and a candle guttering in the corner nearly sputters out. Whether or not the supernatural is truly present, the participants feel calmer, lulled into a strange serenity that might, if they were lucky, translate into better sleep once they went home. Quirkier still was the enthusiasm for animal magnetism, a healing method introduced earlier in the century by Franz Mesmer. Practitioners would wave their hands in sweeping gestures over the insomniac's body, claiming to realign invisible fluids or magnetic currents. Patients often reported sinking into trance-like states. Did they actually sleep, or were they simply hypnotized by the suggestion and the dramatic hand-waving? Historians still argue whether mesmerism was genuine therapy or elaborate stagecraft. Either way, many Victorians swore by it. You imagine reclining in a stiff wooden chair as a magnetizer in a frock coat circles you, waving his arms in patterns that resemble someone conducting a silent orchestra. He whispers instructions, perhaps telling you your eyelids grow heavy. And you do feel heavier, not because of mystical magnetism, but because the entire performance is exhausting to watch. Still, there's no denying that countless people paid good money to experience this supposed cure. Some remedies leaned even further into the mystical. Certain insomniacs visited astrologers who charted sleeplessness by moon phases. Others carried talismans, amulets of silver or carved wood, believing that specific shapes could absorb restless energy. Folklore blended with medicine in curious ways. One fringe manual even advised placing a Bible under your pillow, not for prayer, but because the sheer weight of the holy book would anchor the spirit and prevent tossing and turning. That might be the first recorded use of divine paperweight therapy. Then came the crystal craze. Small quartz stones were sometimes marketed as conduits for calming energy. Housewives tucked them under mattresses. Gentlemen kept them in pockets of nightshirts. Did crystals work? Likely no more than lettuce leaves, but they sparkled nicely in candlelight, which is something, at least. As you drift through these spiritualist settings, you notice something profound. Whether it was seance, magnetism, or talismans, the remedies shared a common effect. They distracted the restless mind. Insomnia thrives on attention, on the way you lie in bed calculating how many hours remain until dawn. But if your evening was spent chanting with a medium or humming under the spell of magnetism, perhaps your worries had less room to fester. A fringe tidbit. In some Victorian households, dreamless sleep was promised through hypnosis performed not by a mesmerist, but by a trusted friend. Manuals circulated instructions. Speak softly, repeat calming phrases, and touch the wrist lightly until the subject succumbed. Families tried it earnestly, turning bedtime into a bizarre hybrid of parlor trick and therapy. You can almost see the scene. A weary father whispering to his anxious daughter, "You are growing drowsy, very drowsy." She giggles at first, then grows serious until finally her head tilts. Her eyelids flutter and, miracle or coincidence, she sleeps. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest rituals, even clumsy ones, can be surprisingly powerful when someone believes in them. Of course, skeptics abounded. Newspapers frequently ridiculed seances as frauds and magnetism as nonsense. Cartoons depicted mediums stuffing bells under their skirts, or mesmerists pocketing coins while patients nodded off. Yet the popularity endured, because in the sleepless hours of the night, ridicule mattered less than relief, and you, sitting there in the parlor as the table shivers and a handbell rings from nowhere, start to feel your own thoughts slow. Whether it's the dim light, the hushed voices, or just the boredom of waiting for a ghost to arrive, your mind eases into stillness. Perhaps that's the true secret. Not whether the spirits are real, but whether the stillness they created was enough to trick the brain into surrender. You leave behind the drifting candle smoke of seances and shuffle onward, this time toward the austere hallways of Victorian medicine. Here, the atmosphere changes. No parlor games, no ghostly whispers, only polished oak desks, rows of heavy medical tomes, and the stern voice of the family physician. If you showed up at a doctor's door complaining you couldn't sleep, you'd often be treated not with sympathy, but with an arsenal of advice that sounds, by modern standards, halfway between stoic self-help and mild torture. The mainstream fact here is that many Victorian doctors prescribed cold water treatments as a way to shock the body into balance. You picture yourself being led down to a tiled bathing room, stripped of your stiff wool clothing, and told to plunge into a tub of icy water just before bedtime. The logic was simple. Cool the overheated nervous system, calm the racing blood, and sleep will follow. The result was less simple. You gasp, shiver, and wonder if the only sleep you'll get is after fainting from hypothermia. If water immersion wasn't enough, bloodletting sometimes reared its head. Yes, even in the 19th century, physicians clung to the notion that removing excess blood could restore balance and ease insomnia. You sit rigidly in a chair as a doctor in spectacles prepares his lancet. The prick is quick, the bowl fills with crimson, and he insists that your overactive brain will be quieter once your body is lighter. Historians still argue whether these late uses of bloodletting were based on tradition, patient expectation, or pure desperation. One thing is certain. If you weren't sleepy before, you probably were after losing a pint of blood. Quirkier advice came in the form of long countryside walks. Medical manuals stressed the benefits of fresh air and vigorous exercise, even at twilight. The notion was that exhausting the muscles would quiet the mind. So you imagine yourself trudging down a damp country lane, boots caked in mud, hedgerows rustling with unseen animals. You're tired, yes, but also cold, damp, and now worried about catching a chill. Still, Victorian physicians praise such walks as tonics for the spirit, ignoring that they mostly ensured patients returned home too worn out to argue. One fringe tidbit: some doctors recommended sleeping with the windows wide open, no matter the season, to purify the air. Picture January frost creeping across the panes as you curl under heavy quilts, nose poking out like a half-frozen rabbit. Did it help with insomnia? Possibly, if you count shivering yourself into unconsciousness. Another odd prescription was the dry diet. Certain practitioners insisted that liquids before bed overstimulated the body, so patients were instructed to avoid tea, broth, or even water in the evening. Instead, they might nibble dry toast, which supposedly absorbed restless vapors. Whether that's medical science or simply a Victorian excuse for stale bread, you decide. Doctors also leaned heavily on moral lectures. Many saw sleeplessness not as a medical condition, but as a failure of discipline. If you were anxious, perhaps you lacked spiritual devotion. If you were restless, maybe you had indulged too much in cards, dancing, or alcohol. One physician even scolded that idleness breeds sleeplessness, suggesting that if patients just worked harder during the day, their nights would be peaceful. You can practically hear the sarcasm in your own head. Nothing soothes insomnia like a side of guilt. And yet, nestled among the harsher remedies, you do find glimpses of ideas that resemble modern advice. Some doctors suggested regular bedtime hours, a cool sleeping environment, or calming evening rituals such as reading scripture or listening to gentle music. These recommendations, stripped of the bloodletting and ice baths, feel strangely familiar. It's almost as if the Victorians stumbled toward concepts of sleep. Hygiene, centuries before the term existed. Historians still argue whether Victorian medicine was truly progressive or just blindly recycling ancient methods. Was the cold bath a precursor to today's cold showers for nervous tension, or just a cruel endurance test? Were long walks therapeutic, or just a way to keep patients busy until they collapsed? The debate lingers, and you can sense the uncertainty even as you imagine sitting in the stiff-backed chair of a Victorian consulting room. The doctor, mustache bristling, leans across the desk. "You must regulate your life," he says sternly, "or your night shall remain restless." You nod obediently, though inside you're thinking you'd rather take your chances with seance tables and magnetism. At least ghosts didn't require you to jump into freezing water before bed. And as you shuffle out of the office, coat collar turned up against the night air, you realize something important. Victorian medical advice, for all its discomfort, revealed an underlying truth. Insomnia was not yet seen as an illness of the mind, but as a disturbance of the body's balance, a disruption that could be corrected with physical discipline, whether through blood, cold, or endless walking. The belief was that the body could be forced into sleep if only the patient tried hard enough. You step away from the physician's stern voice and slip quietly into the more intimate world of the Victorian bedroom. This is where insomnia truly played out, not in lecture halls or apothecaries, but in the drafty, cluttered spaces where people actually tried to rest. Here you find the furniture creaks, the curtains smell faintly of coal smoke, and the bed itself becomes both a sanctuary and a battlefield. The mainstream fact: most Victorian households invested significant thought, and often money, into sleep environments. A bed wasn't just a place to collapse. It was a carefully crafted piece of furniture, usually of carved wood or wrought iron, built to display status as much as to support the weary body. Mattresses were stuffed with feathers, horsehair, or straw, layered beneath heavy wool blankets and quilts. You imagine yourself sinking into one, only to realize the stuffing shifts into awkward lumps, leaving your spine angled like a crooked fence. Luxurious, yes, but also not exactly orthopedic. Insomnia sufferers were told to control their environments with the seriousness of soldiers. Heavy drapes were drawn tight across windows to block the street lamps, though this often turned bedrooms into airless caves. Thick carpets muffled footsteps, while bed hangings were meant to cocoon sleepers from drafts. You picture the oppressive silence, except for the occasional distant clatter of a horse-drawn cab, or the tick of the mantel clock, which somehow grows louder with each restless minute. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians believed in the strategic placement of furniture to promote rest. Beds were angled away from chimneys, lest fumes stir agitation. Mirrors were sometimes draped at night, because staring at your own pale reflection in moonlight was thought to disturb the nerves. One fringe manual even warned against aligning the bed north-south, claiming that the Earth's magnetic pull might interfere with sleep rhythms. If you've ever blamed your insomnia on the position of your bed, congratulations, you share the logic of a 19th century housewife. Scent was another weapon in the fight for sleep. Sachets of lavender or chamomile were tucked into pillows, a practice that still survives today. But the Victorians went further. Some sprinkled vinegar on bed sheets to cleanse the air. Imagine settling into feather bedding that reeks faintly of pickles. Calming, perhaps not, but at least no germs or friends would linger too close. Lighting, too, was a delicate balance. A candle left burning too long risked fire. Gaslight hissed and filled rooms with fumes. Yet complete darkness was unsettling to many. The compromise was often a small night lamp filled with whale oil or paraffin, glowing dimly and flickering shadows across wallpaper patterns of vines and cherubs. For insomniacs, that flickering shadow was either soothing or maddening, depending on the night. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were practical solutions or symbolic gestures. Were the thick drapes and heavy quilts genuinely about warmth and silence? Or were they displays of wealth disguised as remedies? Was the lavender truly medicinal, or simply a way to justify endless sachet making? The debate continues, reminding you that even the most ordinary bedroom could double as a cultural statement. One fringe tidbit involves soundscapes. Some Victorians used contraptions like whispering fans or tinkling water fountains to provide background noise. Picture a delicate tabletop fountain, the water burbling endlessly into a tiny basin. It's like an early version of your modern white noise machine, except it occasionally leaks and ruins the carpet. Still, it demonstrates that even then, people understood the soothing power of consistent, gentle sound. You can almost feel yourself in such a room now, wrapped under a mound of covers, drapes drawn so tightly you can't tell whether it's midnight or dawn. The mattress sags, the clock ticks, and a faint smell of vinegar mingles with lavender. You shift left, then right. Somewhere outside, a neighbor coughs, and you start counting each cough like sheep. The Victorian bedroom, for all its comforts, wasn't always a restful place. It was simply where insomnia happened most vividly. And so you lie there, considering whether the angle of your bed aligns with the Earth's pole, whether the lavender sachet is too pungent, whether the faint draft is creeping under the door. You smile faintly at the absurdity of it all. Because while much has changed, the restless calculations of a sleepless night feel timeless. You slip quietly out of the stuffy bedroom, past the sagging mattress and vinegar sachets, and into the polished drawing rooms of the upper classes. Here, insomnia isn't just a private battle fought against lumps in a featherbed. It's practically a lifestyle choice. Gentlefolk, cushioned by wealth and servants, often turn their restless nights into elaborate social rituals. You find yourself in a parlor glowing with firelight, surrounded by velvet upholstery, where the absence of sleep feels less like a burden and more like another opportunity for leisure. The mainstream fact is that Victorian elites frequently cultivated a culture of late-night salons. Rather than tossing and turning alone, they gathered with friends or family for quiet reading circles, piano recitals, or storytelling by lamplight. For insomniacs in these circles, sleeplessness was reframed not as illness, but as cultivated wakefulness. You picture yourself perched on a chaise longue, sipping a mild cordial, listening as someone recites Wordsworth in a voice so steady it's almost hypnotic. Perhaps you're no closer to sleep, but the night feels less lonely. One quirky detail: some aristocrats kept entire night wardrobes of elegant gowns and robes, meant only for after-midnight entertaining. Imagine being unable to sleep and thinking, well, time to change into my special silk insomnia outfit. Servants padded softly through hallways carrying trays of cocoa or warm punch, while their employers treated the hours after midnight as an extension of polite society. What you might call insomnia today, they sometimes labeled refinement. Music was a common balm. Gentlefolk gathered around pianos for nocturnes, mazurkas, or soft hymn arrangements. You can almost hear the sound. Delicate, meandering melodies drifting across a quiet room. The kind that lull you into that half-dreamy state where time slips sideways. Of course, one false note or overly spirited polka might snap you fully awake again. Historians still argue whether these late-night sessions genuinely aided rest or merely normalized sleeplessness among the upper crust. Literature, too, played its role. Wealthy households boasted private libraries, and sleepless individuals wandered through shelves by candlelight, plucking volumes of poetry, travelogues, or moral essays. One eccentric diarist recorded reading Pliny the Elder until dawn, insisting that the sheer density of the prose eventually knocked him out. That's basically the 19th century version of falling asleep to an economics textbook. Sometimes the cure is boredom itself. A fringe tidbit. In some elite circles, dream diaries became fashionable. Gentlefolk would rise at odd hours to scribble down fragmented visions, turning restless nights into artistic projects. Some even hosted dream salons, where participants shared their surreal midnight notes. Imagine standing in a candlelit room at 3 a.m., listening to Lady So-and-so describe her dream of a giant turnip chasing her across Hyde Park. Hardly restful, but certainly memorable. There's also the ritual of midnight feasts. Though doctors frowned on eating too heavily before bed, some hosts ignored the advice and laid out spreads of sandwiches, fruit, and pastries for their fellow insomniacs. You help yourself to a slice of sponge cake, thinking perhaps sugar will lull you into sleep. Spoiler, it doesn't, but it does make the night sweeter. In these upper-class routines, insomnia transformed from a medical nuisance into a kind of social theatre. Sleeplessness wasn't suffered in silence. It was dressed up, performed, and even celebrated. You imagine the glow of the fireplace, the low hum of conversation, the soft rustle of silk sleeves, and realize while the working poor collapsed in exhaustion after 14-hour days, the wealthy had the luxury to treat insomnia as an elegant diversion. And yet, even here, you sense the undercurrent of unease. As dawn approached, servants would open curtains to reveal pale, tired faces of masters who had laughed and read all night but were still unrested. Insomnia might have been repackaged as leisure, but its toll was still written in drooping eyelids and sluggish mornings. Still, in the moment, the parlour glows with comfort. You sink back into a velvet chair, half listening to a lullaby plucked on the piano. The night stretches endlessly, but here it feels safe, padded by wealth and softened by ritual. If you can't sleep, at least you can drift. You step out of the velvet-draped parlour of the wealthy and wander down narrower streets, where the air grows thicker, the houses lean closer, and insomnia looks very different. Here, in the cramped tenements and soot-stained back rooms of the working class, sleeplessness isn't about refined poetry readings or midnight sponge cake. It's tangled up with exhaustion, overcrowding, and the ceaseless grind of factory schedules. The mainstream fact. Industrial Britain demanded long hours of labour, 12, sometimes 14 a day. Factory workers, miners, dockhands, and seamstresses often returned home so worn out they collapsed straight into bed. And yet, despite bone-deep fatigue, insomnia still haunted them. Poor air quality, cramped sleeping quarters, and irregular shifts disrupted natural rest. You imagine trudging up narrow staircases, opening the door to a single room shared by an entire family, where straw mattresses line the floor and the air smells of damp clothes and coal dust. One quirky detail: some households resorted to hot bunking, where beds were shared in shifts. If you worked the night shift, you took the mattress your brother just vacated, still warm from his body. There's no luxury of lavender sachets or dream diaries here, just the hope that the mattress isn't too damp from someone else's sweat. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were simply pragmatic, or if they exacerbated health problems like insomnia by making real rest impossible. Noise was a constant enemy. Street vendors shouted, carts rattled over cobblestones, neighbours argued through thin walls. Without thick curtains or muffling carpets, every sound pierced the night. You picture yourself lying in a corner, listening to the endless rhythm of horse hooves and wagon wheels, thinking, this is less lullaby, more percussion concert. Lighting was also an issue. Many workers couldn't afford proper shutters, so the glow of street lamps or even moonlight spilled across faces as they tried to rest. A rag might be nailed over a window, but drafts snuck in anyway. The result, sleep that was shallow, fragmented, and often interrupted by a cough, a baby's cry, or a factory whistle summoning the next shift before dawn. A fringe tidbit. In some industrial towns, workers swore by odd folk cures to catch sleep despite chaos. One practice involved placing a pair of boots upside down at the foot of the bed, supposedly to confuse restless spirits that kept people awake. Another suggested rubbing onion juice on the temples to calm nerves. Did either work? Probably not. But when you're desperate for sleep in a room of snoring siblings, you'll try anything. Gender played a role here too. Working class women, especially mothers, bore double burdens. After long hours in textile mills or laundries, they returned home to feed families, wash clothes, and nurse children through the night. Insomnia wasn't a mystery to them. It was simply part of their reality. You can almost feel the bone-deep weariness of a woman rocking a baby at 2 a.m. Her own eyelids heavy, her body screaming for rest, yet sleep perpetually out of reach. Even leisure was limited. Unlike the upper classes who turned sleeplessness into parlor culture, the working poor rarely had time or resources for elaborate midnight routines. If they couldn't sleep, they might simply sit by a tiny fire, mending clothes or staring into the embers until their shift demanded they return to labor. For them, insomnia was not poetic. It was practical, unrelenting, and largely invisible. And yet, within this struggle, there were moments of resilience. Families developed their own rituals to soften sleepless nights, sharing stories, humming lullabies, or passing around a communal mug of warm milk when they could afford it. In these small acts, insomnia became less a lonely battle and more a collective endurance. You find yourself seated in one such room now, on a straw mattress in a corner, listening to a father tell his children a story about a ship that sailed without sails. The children giggle softly, the mother nods along, and for a moment, even the weary seem soothed. Sleep may not come easily, but a kind of peace does. You leave behind the cramped tenements and drift toward another layer of Victorian society, one that rarely shows up in novels or polite discussions, the world of the insane asylum. Here, insomnia wasn't just a nuisance or a product of poverty. It was redefined as a medical symptom, a marker of pathology, something to be measured, treated, and sometimes punished. The mainstream fact: during the Victorian era, Britain saw a surge in asylum construction. Madness was increasingly categorized, labeled, and housed under roofs of brick and iron. Within these institutions, sleeplessness was not seen as mere bad luck. It was a sign perhaps of overexcitement of the brain, nervous exhaustion, or a symptom of moral failing. Doctors kept notes on who tossed through the night, who woke screaming, who lay silently staring at the ceiling until morning rounds. One eerie detail: attendants sometimes walked corridors with lanterns at 3 a.m., peering into iron-barred dormitories where rows of patients sat up in bed, wide-eyed, unable to rest. Imagine the shuffle of footsteps, the creak of doors, the dim halo of light sweeping across faces twisted by sleeplessness. For doctors, these were clinical observations. For patients, they were moments of endless night. Treatment, such as it was, varied wildly. Some asylums dosed patients with bromides, opiates, or chloral hydrate, an early sedative that left many groggy, dependent, or worse. Others relied on non-pharmacological interventions. Long walks in the asylum gardens, warm baths, or enforced silence after a certain hour. There's even record of padded rooms used not just for safety, but as spaces where restless patients were left in darkness until they quieted themselves. You can't help but wonder, was that meant to heal, or merely to control? A fringe tidbit: one 19th century asylum superintendent claimed that knitting was a cure for female patients who couldn't sleep. By giving them needles and yarn, he believed their fidgety nerves would be soothed into drowsiness. You can picture it. rows of women clicking needles under dim light, some perhaps finding calm in the rhythm, others resenting yet another enforced occupation. Whether it worked is doubtful, but it reflected the Victorian impulse to regiment even the hours of the sleepless. For men, insomnia inside asylums often took on a different narrative. Doctors sometimes framed it as evidence of overwork or excess intellectual strain, particularly for clerks, teachers, or ministers whose minds were thought to have burned too brightly. For women, however, sleeplessness was more often tied to hysteria, menstruation, or supposed weakness of constitution. The same symptom, different diagnoses, different treatments, depending on gender, an unsettling practice, cold water therapies. In some institutions, sleepless patients were subjected to douche baths, streams of icy water poured over the head and back to shock the system into regulation. Others were wrapped in wet sheets and left to cool their nerves. If you imagine this in the middle of winter, you might shiver at the thought of such a cure being more torture than relief. Still, not all accounts are grim. Some physicians genuinely sought to understand sleeplessness with compassion. They noted how patients described their minds as too full of thoughts, or their bodies as weighted with invisible burdens. A few even encouraged journaling or prayer before bed, acknowledging that mental rest mattered as much as physical. But from the patient's perspective, insomnia in asylums could easily blur into despair. To be watched through the night, medicated without consent, or left pacing a locked corridor was to have sleeplessness turned into evidence of madness itself. If you could not sleep, you were ill, and if you were ill, you did not deserve the freedom of the outside world. You walk now through such a ward in your imagination. The gas lamps hiss faintly. Somewhere a man mutters into his pillow. A woman hums a lullaby to herself, over and over, as though trying to summon the sleep that refuses to come. A nurse makes her rounds, writing in a logbook, "No rest." The walls seem to hum with the tension of countless nights spent awake. For you, passing through, it is haunting. For them, trapped within, it was life itself. You leave the asylum corridors behind and step into lecture halls filled with chalk dust and the smell of polished wood. Here, sleeplessness isn't treated as madness, but as a scientific puzzle. Victorian medicine was on the brink of becoming modern neuroscience, though no one quite knew what the brain was up to when the lamps went out. The mainstream fact, by the mid-1800s, neurologists were busy debating brain fatigue. A prominent theory held that the mind, like a muscle, wore itself down during the day. Sleep was thought to be the body's way of draining waste products from overworked brain tissue. If you couldn't sleep, it wasn't a moral flaw, but a physical backlog, a failure to clear out the debris of thought. This marked a slow shift from sermons about sinful worry to more mechanistic, biological explanations. And yet, the Victorians weren't shy about mixing in philosophy with their science. One doctor argued that sleeplessness reflected an overwrought civilization, proof that society itself was advancing faster than human nerves could handle. In his telling, every factory whistle and telegraph line tightened the collective brain until rest became a rare luxury. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Scroll through your phone at 2 a.m. and you've joined the same club. Quirky detail. Some Victorian scientists experimented with devices they claimed could measure brain activity during sleep. One contraption used metal plates pressed to the scalp, attached by wires to a galvanometer. The idea was to record subtle electrical currents from dreaming minds. Spoiler alert, it mostly measured sweaty foreheads and static shocks. Still, you have to admire the determination. They were fumbling toward EEGs with little more than copper, ink, and blind optimism. Historians still argue whether these early studies counted as real science or enthusiastic guesswork. On one hand, they set the stage for modern sleep research. On the other, many findings rested on anecdotes from a few wealthy patients, or worse, on the physicians themselves, proudly reporting their own midnight musings as evidence. Imagine a research paper today that basically reads, "Couldn't sleep last night. Definitely due to cerebral congestion. More tests tomorrow, maybe." Meanwhile, debates flared over stimulants and depressants. Was coffee the villain behind the insomnia epidemic? Some neurologists condemned the habit of sipping strong brews late into the evening. calling it a scourge of intellectual workers. Others pointed to alcohol, particularly the nightcap, as a dangerous short-term fix that deepened long-term sleeplessness. One researcher even suggested banning pubs after sunset to restore the nation's sleep. You can imagine how popular that proposal was. Another oddity, animal experiments. In attempts to crack the code of sleeplessness, scientists sometimes kept dogs awake for days, then recorded their decline in appetite, mood, and movement. The results were grim but unsurprising. Exhaustion set in, and some animals never fully recovered. These early insomnia models hinted that sleep was not optional. It was fundamental to survival. Of course, theories multiplied faster than anyone could prove them. Was sleeplessness caused by overstimulation of the sensory organs, by indigestion, by too much blood in the brain? Or was it something more elusive, an intangible restlessness of the soul? One neurologist insisted that sleepless patients should practice mental blankness, training themselves to erase every thought before bed. Another swore by counting not sheep, but slowly reciting multiplication tables until the brain surrendered. You picture a weary clerk whispering 17 times 17 into the darkness, waiting for slumber to take pity. In all this, you sense a pattern. Victorians were inching closer to modern ideas of nervous exhaustion, yet they couldn't let go of moral judgment. A sleepless person was at once a patient and a culprit, someone whose body failed and whose habits deserved scrutiny. That tension, the clash between compassion and blame, echoes in every study you skim. You sit at the back of the lecture hall, watching a professor sketch a brain on the blackboard. The chalk squeaks. He talks of electrical storms in the nerves, of fatigue piling up like soot in a chimney. Around you, students scribble notes by lamplight, their eyelids heavy after hours of lectures. Irony strikes again. Half the men training to cure sleeplessness are nodding off at their desks. The bell rings, the hall empties, and the theories scatter like dust motes in the fading light. You're left with the sense that Victorians were closer to understanding sleep than they realized, yet still hopelessly tangled in superstition, overconfidence, and the sheer human tendency to argue about everything long after bedtime. You wander out of the lecture halls and into the dim glow of a reading lamp. The smell of old leather bindings clings to the air, and you realize insomnia didn't just haunt doctors and patients. It seeped into literature, staining the pages of novels with sleepless confessions. The mainstream fact first. Charles Dickens himself suffered bouts of insomnia, pacing the streets of London at all hours. He wrote about these walks in vivid detail, turning the restless city into a character of its own. Those midnight rambles weren't just personal, they slipped into his fiction, giving his stories that peculiar blend of nocturnal unease and moral observation. When you read Dickens, you're not just following his characters. You're wandering with him through fog-drenched alleys at 2 in the morning, hearing the same distant carriage wheels. Quirky tidbit. The Bronte sisters use sleeplessness almost like seasoning in their novels. Charlotte Bronte's Villette lingers on night scenes where the heroine cannot rest, describing the walls breathing, the furniture creaking, the mind spinning like a top. Victorians knew the sensation intimately, and those passages carried a strangely relatable ache. You could almost market the Brontes as Victorian ASMR writers, except instead of soothing whispers, you get gothic dread and drafty windows. Historians still argue whether these sleepless descriptions were autobiographical truths or literary devices. Did the Brontes themselves endure long nights of insomnia? Or were they simply tapping into a cultural mood that readers recognized? Either way, the effect is the same. Insomnia became a metaphor for longing, frustration, and the sheer stubbornness of thought that refuses to dim when the candle goes out. The trope spread across genres. In medical novels, the sleepless patient symbolized fragile nerves. In Gothic tales, insomnia blurred the line between dreams and reality. And in sentimental fiction, late-night wakefulness became the perfect stage for inner monologues, because nothing says heartbreak like staring at the ceiling until dawn. One curious fringe example, Wilkie Collins, author of The Moonstone, was notorious for relying on laudanum to soothe his own insomnia. His habit seeps into his characters, who often grapple with mysterious drugs, restless nights, and half-dreamt visions. It's as though every time Collins nodded off at last, he smuggled fragments of his opiate-fueled dreams back into print. Of course, not all writers lamented sleeplessness. Some celebrated it. Thomas de Quincey, better known for his Confessions of an English Opium Eater, claimed that night-waking opened new realms of imagination. To him, insomnia wasn't just a curse. It was a doorway into surreal landscapes, a private gallery of visions too rich to be wasted on sleep. You can almost picture him, quill in hand at 4 in the morning, muttering, "Well, since I'm awake anyway, might as well invent a whole new metaphor for eternity." Literary critics note that Victorians made sleeplessness fashionable in a way. To be awake when the rest of the world slumbered was to be special, to possess a keener sensitivity, even if it came with exhaustion. It was the badge of poets, thinkers, and melancholics, like a gloomy club where the entry fee was paid in yawns. You curl into a chair by the fire, leafing through these pages, and the words themselves feel drowsy. Sentences meander, paragraphs swell with digressions, and even the writers seem to nod in and out as they compose. But through it all runs a truth you can recognize. Literature became a mirror for a society that couldn't rest, translating midnight tossing into ink, so that no one would feel alone in the long hours before dawn. And somewhere in those fictional insomnias, Dickens' wandering feet, Bronte's haunted rooms, Collins' laudanum haze, you hear your own restless nights echoed back. The Victorians, it seems, were writing not just for themselves, but for every reader who has ever whispered, "Why can't I sleep?" Into the dark, the lamps fade, and the century itself begins to drowse. By the end of the Victorian era, the sleepless empire had left behind not only ornate tea sets and soot-stained skylines, but also a catalogue of remedies that refused to die quietly. You trail behind as some of these practices stagger into the 20th century, like eccentric relatives who never got the memo that the party was over. The mainstream fact: many of the patent medicines peddled in 1890 were still for sale in 1910. Their formulas only slightly tweaked, or in some cases, unchanged. Chloral hydrate, once marketed as the perfect sleep draught, continued to appear in medical texts well into the Edwardian years, despite rising concerns about dependence. Over-the-counter tonics blended alcohol, herbs, and barbiturate precursors, slipping under looser regulations until consumer protection laws tightened. You could almost say Victorians passed down insomnia in a bottle, like a peculiar family heirloom. The quirky legacy is hard to miss. Beef tea lingered in British kitchens far longer than anyone cared to admit. By 1920, magazines still printed recipes insisting that a small cup before bed steadied the nerves. Imagine generations of bleary-eyed sleepers forcing down lukewarm beef broth at midnight, muttering, "This worked for great-grandfather, so it must work for me." It's a family tradition no one wanted, but everyone inherited. Historians still argue whether the Victorians' obsession with insomnia was a cultural overreaction or an early recognition of a genuine health crisis. Was sleeplessness truly more common? Or did the new scientific and literary attention simply make people more aware of their tossing and turning? The debate continues, with some scholars pointing out that records from earlier centuries also describe night waking, but without the avalanche of tonics, devices, and theories Victorians amassed. As you step further into the early 20th century, the cures begin to morph. Electric gadgets replace gaslit contraptions, and hypnotic medications arrive with even shinier promises. Yet the old Victorian methods never vanish entirely. Feather mattresses stay popular, heavy drapes still hang in bedrooms, and the advice to take a late-night stroll or sip warm milk echoes across decades. The empire may fade, but the bedtime rituals remain stubbornly familiar. It's almost funny. So many remedies designed to shorten sleepless nights ended up making them longer. Laudanum bred addiction, chloral hydrate left hangovers, and gadgets hummed uselessly until their wires frayed. But in their failure, they created stories, traditions, and habits, strange gifts that we still unwrap today. Every time you see an all-natural sleep tonic advertised online, or a lifestyle guru promoting blackout curtains and weighted blankets, you're glimpsing the ghost of Victorian insomnia advice, dressed up in modern fabric. and you can't help but chuckle at the sheer determination of it all. A society plagued by overwork and overstimulation decided the solution was more stimulants, more gadgets, more theories. You imagine a Victorian gentleman lying awake, surrounded by a clutter of patent bottles, weighted hats, and unread Dickens novels, muttering, "Any day now, science will solve this." But science, like sleep, comes slowly. And as you leave the fading century behind, you realize the real inheritance isn't the cures themselves, but the shared experience. The timeless, universal truth that human beings have always wrestled with rest. The empire dimmed, the gas lamps flickered out, but the insomnia remained. And in that restless continuity lies a strange kind of comfort. No matter how many centuries pass, you are never alone in the night. And now, as the story closes, you let the images soften. The clinking bottles of patent medicines fade into the background. The heavy drapes fall quiet, and the creak of a Victorian mattress dissolves into silence. The voices of doctors, writers, and sleepless wanderers blur together, like distant echoes carried on a slow night breeze. You breathe in, long and steady, as though you were stepping out of a foggy London street and into a calm countryside lane. The gas lamps dim one by one. The restless city quiets. Even the ticking clocks seem to slow their pace, each second stretching further apart, until time itself feels drowsy. Your body loosens, heavy yet comfortable, like sinking into a featherbed warmed just enough by the fading glow of a coal fire. Each muscle lets go, following the rhythm of breath, like curtains settling after a draft. The remedies you've heard about, strange tonics, bizarre gadgets, whispered prayers, become distant curiosities, tucked safely into the museum of memory. They are no longer worries, just gentle stories, stepping stones that led you here. What remains is the steady reassurance that sleeplessness is not an enemy to fear, but a shared human rhythm, one that eventually gives way to rest. So let the words drift further away, softening into a murmur. Let the night cradle you. Let your thoughts scatter like ash from a dying lamp flame, dissolving into quiet. There is nothing left to do, nothing to hold, only rest. And with that, we leave the Victorians to their peculiar cures, and you, finally, blissfully, can let yourself fall asleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.